So last week, it was reported that Joshua Vann versus Tatsuro Taira is in the works for UFC 327, April 11th in Miami. And this was first reported by Kevin K. And if you're not familiar with him, he's one of the best fight reporters out there. He's usually dead on with what he puts out. So I definitely recommend giving him a follow. And Van also confirmed that something was signed on Facebook. This seems very real, even though it hasn't been officially announced by the UFC yet. Seems like something's brewing. Now, let me ask you, do you like this fight? Is this the right matchup to make? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're new here, hit subscribe, help the channel grow, and I really appreciate it. Thanks. Because I'll say this right away, my guy, Josh Vann, he can finally get busy. He's been grinding, he's been trying to get back in there, just trying to get a fight. He's been calling for a fight ever since he won the belt. He wants to prove he's the real champ and not just a quote paper champ. And that's what's surprising to me is this whole time it felt like it could either be Manel Kape or Taira, but honestly, it felt like Kape was the one. Van and Kape were going back and forth online, calling each other out, talking about contracts, sign this, sign that, but it never happened. So, unless this fight falls through, I'm genuinely surprised Kape didn't get this title shot. Because in my mind, with Pantoja out, Kape was the most deserving guy in this division. This matchup with Taira tells us a couple things. First, it probably means Pantoja is going to be out longer than the UFC wants. They're keeping the belt active instead of just waiting around to do an immediate rematch. Because let's be real, whenever Pantoja comes back, he's getting a title shot. There's no question about that. Depending on how this goes, it might be against Taira now. And second, it also suggests Kape was never getting the title shot. No matter how logical it seemed to us, no matter how sure we were about it, because I felt sure, but I guess he was never going to get it. Because Kape tweeted that the UFC promised a title shot to Taira and that him and his team were still pushing for that March 7th date anyways. So if that's true, the UFC clearly prefers Taira in this spot, whether it's because they think he's more deserving, a bigger future star, or both. They think Taira's the one. Now, again, I still think Kape is the most deserving with Pantoja's sideline, but I get it. Taira, he has a strong case too. And of course, you got Kyoji Horiguchi. He's in the mix. He's coming off a win over Amir Albazi, creeping into the top tier contenders. So, yeah, the top of flyweight, it is crowded, but here's another layer. Stylistically, I think out of the whole top five, I actually think Kape was the most dangerous fight for Van. Van is going to stand and strike. That's who he is. And if you're standing and striking with Kape, you're playing with a guy I consider to be the more precise, just the sharper striker. I didn't like that matchup for Van, but was going to be an exciting fight, so I really wanted it. Plus that fight, it already had heat. It had storyline. Kape was talking crazy, saying he put Van in diapers, calling himself his daddy, pushing hard for that March 7th date. And Van fired right back, taking a shot at Kape's gyno and calling him fat for not being able to turn around quickly enough to fill that co-main spot of 324 after Harrison and Nunes fell through. So with all that built up, you would think the UFC would cash that check, especially how they've been booking fights lately. But turns out, according to Kape, 326, it actually wasn't possible. They were just pushing for it, but it wasn't going to happen. But here's the weird part too. There's another weird part to this. During the UFC 325 broadcast, they showed a graphic for the UFC 326 main card, and the co-main event was still listed as to be determined. So with that graphic floating out there, plus Kape accusing Van of not signing, plus Van looking like he'd fight anyone ASAP, as soon as possible, just give me a fight. it makes me think that the UFC already knew what they wanted. Which brings me to this. What was this co-main graphic even about then? Because at this point, we're only a few weeks out, and it feels like it's already too late. You can't fill that spot now. Maybe we get answers soon. Right now, I haven't seen much else come out besides Kop's response. And Taira, he hasn't really said anything publicly either. And Van hasn't said much either beyond, something is signed. Yeah, we're staying locked in on it. Now, quick note on Horiguchi. I don't think anyone truly believed he was next for Van. If anything, I thought if Kop was next for Van, then Horiguchi, he made more sense to fight Taira. But it seems like the UFC just wants that Japan champion storyline. It's sitting there at the top right now too with Horiguchi and Taira. Because if Taira becomes champ, suddenly there's a very obvious reason to take a big card to Japan. And if Taira loses, then Horiguchi could still slide in right after. Just depending on what the UFC wants to do. Personally, I think Pantoja returns to face the winner of this fight instead. And if that's the case, then Kop might as well fight Horiguchi. Because if Kop sits out, two things happen. One, you're basically going to sit out most of the year. And two, they might just let Horiguchi jump you in line anyway. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. You know what? I'd be willing to bet that that does happen. They might as well just fight. And if you beat Horiguchi, okay, now you're undeniable. But yeah, it's hard to predict exactly how this shakes out with this many title contenders. But as far as Van versus Taira goes, I actually do like this fight for Van. Not because it's easy, it's not. But Taira, we know he's a real ground threat in this division. But Van, he doesn't panic. And against a grappler, I think that's pretty important. I'm confident in Van's takedown defense, even though we honestly haven't seen him deal with elite takedowns much in the UFC run yet. Just the bigger question is what happens if he does get taken down? I saw Van recently got his blue belt, and obviously that doesn't mean he's some submission wizard overnight, but the key is he trains MMA jiu-jitsu and not just sport jiu-jitsu. I think that's pretty important too. I don't know what belt Taira is, but I'm sure he's a level above Van on the mat. So we'll see. I'll do just a full breakdown and prediction when we get closer to the fight. But overall, if this is real, I'm just happy my guy Van is fighting again. Again, it's not official yet, but Kevin K has been reliable, and Van saying something is signed tells you there's definitely smoke there. So if this ends up being a main event or a big headline spot, then good. I'm happy for both these guys. I'm happy for this division. Van feels like the type of champ who stays active if the UFC lets him. I can't shake this feeling that the UFC missed on an opportunity though. Taira, he's absolutely deserving. No hate there. But if the UFC has been leaning into fire fights with matchmaking lately, how do you not make Van versus Kop with the beef, with the style clash and the energy? Unless it's the other side of UFC matchmaking. Sometimes they don't just book the best fight. They book the fight that builds the future they want. And if Taira becomes champ, now the UFC has every reason to take a card to Japan and build a massive fan base. It's already there, to be honest. I mean, there's a huge MMA fan base there, just not a huge UFC fan base because we don't always go there. So the division is rolling, and now we're just waiting on Pantoja to return and shake the whole thing up again. So I'm excited for that. And just want to say thank you for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. Check out some other videos if you like this one. And I appreciate you watching. Talk to you soon. Bye.